In this lecture video, I'm going to be looking at Martin Heidegger's The Origin of the Work of Art, a fascinating essay that really does a great job at looking at the relation between aesthetics and knowledge, really complicating a traditional account of art as something perhaps that is more concerned with feeling, perhaps subjective experience, or other things that are not necessarily connected with ways of manifesting truth. And yet Heidegger is going to show us how it is that art actually is a manifestation, that the work of art is a manifestation, an unconcealing of that which is, of truth. I'm going to do this in two parts. This first part is going to be concerned with a critique of the traditional various ways of approaching art and the question of what is the origin of the work of art. And this will really open up a new way of thinking about the relation between art and truth, which I will approach in the second video. Now, we first have to understand what phenomenology is, because the method that Heidegger undertakes is his own phenomenological method. Of course, Heidegger was a student of Edmund Husserl, the kind of father of phenomenology in continental philosophy. Heidegger breaks from Husserl in a few ways, not just with the way in which he references certain concepts that were invented by Husserl. But so, very simply, phenomenology is the study of the appearances of things, that it's a way of approaching traditional questions in philosophy that do not make assumptions, or that are more self-critical, we might say. As where ontology or metaphysics is going to be interested in the thing itself, right? What that thing is, or epistemology is going to be interested in what knowledge is, how we have knowledge. That phenomenology is going to want to be a bit more critical and ask, well, how does this thing called knowledge, when we think we know things, our experiences, how do they present themselves to us, right? That we can't just talk about these things without understanding how these very things we talk about present themselves to us. So if we want to know what knowledge is, we have to investigate the way in which we experience things called knowledge. The natural attitude, as developed by Husserl, is that kind of mode of experiencing. It's the everyday manner of inhabiting the world, right? In which we live in the world and we presume ourselves independent from the things around us. That we take certain things for granted. That if I'm going to walk out the door to go outside, I don't first approach a thing that I think might be a door, and I question, can I justify that when I reach my hand out to touch the handle, and I turn the handle, that I know for sure that the handle will open the door as what I think a door is supposed to do, right? We don't do that. We just approach the door and we use it as a door in a way that we kind of take it for granted, right? That's the natural attitude, kind of the way in which we ordinarily inhabit and make our way through the world in this kind of givenness. Now, Heidegger refers to this as ready to hand, that these objects are ready to hand. Now, the phenomenological attitude is a more critical approach to that givenness of our everyday experience. Heidegger refers to this as the clearing, that we bracket off our experience in the natural attitude, right? We kind of set it aside where we think, normally, right, when I approach this door, I would just reach for the handle and I wouldn't think two things about it. And sometimes, actually, this phenomenological attitude occurs when we don't mean to engage in it. Like, for example, if it turns out the handle is broke, I don't know yet, right? So I'm approaching the door to go outside, I reach my hand out, I go to turn the handle, and it's stuck. All of a sudden, there's a kind of a moment where this kind of almost subconscious movement of just expecting the handle to open makes me stop and reevaluate, what just happened, right? And then, we come out of the phenomenological attitude, right? But so phenomenology wants to embrace the phenomenological attitude, bracketing off that givenness of experience and investigate. Why was it, for example, that when I went to turn the door handle, that when it did not work, it made me pause for a moment as if things were thrown off? What are the presuppositions that make up the character of such experience? Right? These are the things that the phenomenological attitude is interested in uncovering. Now, what Heidegger does is he begins from lived experience with what the German phrase he uses, Dasein, with being there. That it is human beings are Dasein. They are beings which question themselves, which reflect on their own consciousness. And that is something unique about human beings, Heidegger argues. And that is why we have to always begin with the human lived experience, because that is where all these concepts, knowledge, truth, and so on, originate. And this is where Heidegger is going to focus on when he's investigating the question, what is the origin of the work of art? It's the human lived experience approach to this question, not art in itself, divorced from whatever it means to be human. This is going to be part of his destruction, so to speak, of metaphysics and his attempt to move beyond essentializing in philosophy. So some preliminary considerations first is, of course, if we're asking the question, what is the origin of art? Another way of asking this question is, what is the source of the essence of art? So we want to know, what is the origin? What is it that produces the possibility of the existence of art? Now, essence, of course, is that thing which it has, which makes it what it is, that if it did not have it, it would not be what it is. The source is sometimes also thought of the essence, though, that which gives rise to the possibility of that being. Heidegger thinks that this question actually leads us into a circle when we try to investigate it through traditional philosophical means. That, as he says, the artist is the origin of the work. The work is the origin of the artist. Neither is without the other. Nevertheless, neither is the sole support of the other. In themselves and in their interrelations, artist and work are each of them by virtue of a third thing which is prior to both, namely, that which also gives artist and work of their names, art. That we might think, in answering this question, what is the source of the essence of art, we might say, well, obviously it's the artist, because the artist is the one that produces art. So the source of art is that individual. Yet we can approach this from the opposite perspective and say, well, there is no artist without art that is produced. What Heidegger, without the work, we should say, that is produced. But what Heidegger wants to say is there's something that links them together, of which they would not be artist or work of art, and that is art. So what is art, not as a product, but as a production, as an experience that makes possible the artist and the artwork? Now, when we approach art, perhaps the most given aspect of art that we take for granted is what Heidegger says is its thingly character, that works of art have a thingly character. As he says, if we consider the works in their untouched actuality and do not deceive ourselves, the result is that the works are as naturally present as are things. The picture hangs on the wall like a rifle or a hat. A painting, for example, the one by Van Gogh that represents a pair of peasant shoes, travels from one exhibition to another. There is something stony in a work of architecture, wooden in a carving, colored in a painting, spoken in a linguistic work like a poem, sonorous in a musical composition. There's something about it where it has this kind of mundane character, which is, again, that thing which we can put in a frame and we can hang it up, we can put it in a closet, we can treat it almost like other objects. What is this thing that we take for granted that constitutes part of the ready at handness of artwork? That is this thingly character. That, again, perhaps a pen. A pen is a kind of thing. What does it mean to be a thing? What does it mean to have this thingly character? Is it different from a piece of art? Why? In what way? Additionally, as he says, art is a thing that is made. So it's unlike a rock, for example, where a rock is perhaps made, but it doesn't have intention, right? It's a product of what we call nature, not a product of the intention of a human being producing something with a desired end result, like a chair, which is to sit in. But art, then, is something other than what the mere thing itself is, like a rock. The work of art is a symbol. It signifies something, something beyond its mere thingliness. As he says, allegory and symbol provide the conceptual frame within whose channel of vision the artwork has long been characterized. That there is something beyond the work of art, and perhaps beyond is the wrong word, as we're going to see, right? It is still within the work of art and yet exceeds it at the same time, which is some story. And as we'll see, perhaps truth, right? Which is involved in language as a means of signifying. In the same way, if there's a thingly character to a book, and the pages, which we can rip, we can crinkle up, we can throw away, we can do whatever with, and yet there's something they signify, some information, we might say. So what is the character of a thing? What constitutes a thing? What makes a thing a thing? How do we experience things? Now, all beings that in any way are, whether they may be soft, whether they may be forever changing, whether they may be hot or whatever else, however we experience those things, however we talk about the way in which they're constituted, if they are a being, they are called things. The word thing designates whatever then is simply not nothing, is not simply nothing. Because if something is nothing, then it cannot be a thing. Because thingness is a kind of mere being. It is a kind of brute being, the most simple of beings. If beings, in any way that they are beings, are called things, that's weird because, well, we might think God is a being, or persons are beings, or animals are beings, and so on. Yet we don't call God, persons, animals, and so on things in the same way we might a rock. As Heidegger says, we would sooner think of a hammer as a thing, or a shoe, or an axe, or a clock. But even these are not mere things. Only a stone, a clod of earth, right, like some mud we pick up, a piece of wood are for us such mere things, and that what they signify isn't very much at all in the way that we might say work of art is. Lifeless beings of nature, like that clod of earth, are objects of use that we can perhaps mold into a hut, let's say, to survive, to provide shelter, to get away from a storm. Natural things and utensils are the things commonly so called as well, like, for example, this pen. This pen is a utensil. It has a certain use, right, to write. Yet it's still more thingly, perhaps, than a book. And a book that has, of course, significance, and that we can read these words, and the words in the book mean to tell us something. So there's a way in approaching the thingness of a work of art that we are wont to dismiss the character of the thing as non-essential, we might say, to a work of art. That it is an accident, that it can be done away with when thinking about what a work of art is. And as we'll see, that has mainly been actually the case in approaching artwork and interpreting artwork. So what Heidegger does is he looks at three traditional ways of looking at the thingness of works of art, and he's going to critique every single one in the same way. Say every single one of them makes an assault upon the artwork, and we'll see why. So first, he looks at thingness as a bearer of traits, that we approach the thingness of works of art according to the bearer of its traits. And what that means is we look at the origin, right? What is the origin of that thing? So interpretations of artwork have become naturalized through reinterpretation, a certain reinterpretation that goes back looking at its origins. And this might make sense, again, with the question of what is the origin of the work of art. So we might ask, well, thingness, for example. Let's look at the origin of thingness. Thingness in Greek, in ancient Greek, hypokemonenon, literally means the underlying thing, often translated as matter, right? Hypokemenon, matter, that base thing, which persists in a thing going through change. Like, for example, if we have a candle and we light the wick of the candle and eventually that wax melts, the matter, in a sense, even though, perhaps it turns to liquid from a solid thing, it still consists of that thingness, the underlying thing which makes the wax a wax, even if it's liquid or hard, a solid. Now, throughout the history of Western philosophy, eventually with, of course, the rise of the Roman Empire and the translating of Greek philosophical texts into Latin, all of these Greek words like hypokemenon gets translated into Latin terms. Like, for example, hypokemenon gets translated into subjectum, which comes known more as a subject, has a bit of a different sense than the literal underlying thing that in ancient Greece hypokemenon meant. Instead now, the way that Romans referred to it is as a subject. So Heidegger says, beneath the seemingly literal and thus faithful translation, there is concealed, rather, a translation of Greek experience into a different way of thinking. Roman thought takes over the Greek words without a corresponding, equally original experience of what they say, without the Greek word. The rootlessness of Western thought begins with this translation, that when the Greeks spoke of hypokemenon, it played a certain role in their world. It had certain status in their life world, right? How they understood their place in ancient Greece, which is different from how Romans understood their place and how they used words, how words made sense in their life. Likewise, right, when we translate hypokemenon to be underlying thing or a subject or, for example, matter, right? Matter takes on a different connotation. It means something perhaps different than what it meant for the Greeks. And so when we try to get at the essence of the term thing or thingness, when we do it through this looking at the origin in terms of the term used in languages, I mean, it is not to say that this is not informational, right? We learn things by doing this, but it actually begins removing the everyday experience, the naturalized experience, the way in which hypokemenon would have been understood in the natural attitude of an ancient Greek citizen as compared to someone living in the 21st century. So the technical and historical terminology does not disclose the thing, which is thingness, as it is in its own being, because what it has done is it has assaulted the original understanding of thingness, because we can never know what it was like to be an ancient Greek citizen, right? We're always looking at it from a distance, and we're never getting at the thing as it is. We end up setting it too far off, as opposed to looking at it up close. Right? That we distort what thingness means by trying to trace it back to its original meaning, because the way in which that word operated is no longer the world in which we live, and it no longer has the same meaning in our world. So we do not get at the essence of thingness by looking at it as a bearer of traits from the past. Perhaps then, since this approach, by looking at it through the bearer of traits, sets it too far off, right? By trying to look at the past, a different way of life of which we no longer inhabit, perhaps then we want to look at it up close. Look at the thingness as it is in its bruteness, its simpleness, as a piece of matter, as something with which the sensations have a direct contact with. So perhaps we can look at thingness as a unity of a manifold of sensations. That if I want to investigate the thingness of a work of art, I touch it, right? And I take into account how it feels. I look at it, and I try to take into account just the direct sensory perception of all the colors and the way in which it presents itself in my experience. In so doing, right, the question then is it possible to avoid this violence of the thingness, to approach thingness without presuppositions, by only being attentive to the perceptions in the work of art as they are manifest? Now, this is a kind of approach that we might think of with a kind of very brute, very crude, maybe, empiricism, right? We might think of, for example, a Lockean or Humean approach to our work in this way, where we focus on the way in which we feel about the work of art. Because if all of our knowledge is constituted by our empirical experiences through our sensations, then it is our sensations as impressions, right, which have the first direct contact with the work of art, with the thingness as it is in itself, before we start putting all sorts of connotations onto the thing, right? Once we start reflecting on it and we start trying to make sense of it. So we want to go to this direct perception. But what Heidegger says with this approach is that we never really first perceive a throng of sensations. For example, tones and noises in a piece of music, or in the appearance of things like a painting on the wall, or a sculpture, as this thing concept alleges. Rather, we hear the storm whistling in the chimney. We hear the three-motored plane. We hear the Mercedes in immediate distinction from the Volkswagen. Much closer to us than all the sensations are the things themselves. That when we listen, for example, a car going down the street, the way in which we might want to close our eyes and listen in what is going on, we're actually isolating certain things that we have to already first identify as things related to, for example, that Volkswagen or the Mercedes. That we have to focus on things that isolate all other aspects of the Volkswagen or the Mercedes. And in so doing, by focusing on that one sensation, or even then trying to focus then with not hearing, but just our vision and so on, each time we're closing off other ways of experiencing it. Right? Because it might think that, well, we're trying to look at all the different ways we can approach the object, all the different angles. But in so doing, from every time, we're only looking at a piece of it, and we're never getting the thing in itself, in its completeness as a thing in itself. So to listen to the sounds of things, we have to divert our attention away from the things in themselves and focus abstractly. And when we focus abstractly, we begin to construct some kind of conception of the object that is always going to be removed from the thing itself. And we still end up assaulting the thing, committing violence upon the thing, insofar as we corrupt the thing as it is in itself when we try to make sense of it in this way. So merely trying to focus on the feeling that an artwork provides us through sensations does not allow us to understand the thingness of the work of art in itself, to get to the nature of the thingness of a work of art. Now, perhaps then, since we spoke of a work of art involving signification, right, in a sense going beyond the mere thingness, we might think of thingness as formed matter. That when we look at, for example, the painting on the canvas, the paint is matter that has been formed in certain ways to isolate certain pigments, to change the consistency to make it more thick or more runny, and the way in which it's combined with then other colors and turned into something that is symbolic. So perhaps then the correct way is to think of thingness as formed matter. Now Heidegger says that this kind of form-matter distinction is most often used in art theory and aesthetics. Now, first, when we think of a piece of equipment, right, we think of a piece of equipment as being thing-like insofar as it is self-contained, right? Insofar as I'm talking into a microphone, the microphone is in a way self-contained in that the way in which it can be interpreted is not given the same kind of liberty as a poem, as a sculpture, where you can have different people competing over what to make of the poem, what to make of the sculpture. That doesn't really happen with a microphone. In a way, it's kind of, again, self-contained in its essence of what it is, of what we think it is, how we make sense of it. Heidegger says, thus, the piece of equipment is a half thing. So the microphone is a kind of half thing, because characterized by thingliness, and yet it is something more. At the same time, it is half artwork, because the microphone is used for certain things, like making a lecture video. So it is involved in a kind of work of art. It is involved in signification. The pen is involved in signification. But it lacks a certain self-sufficiency of artwork. A self-sufficiency insofar as it conveys meaning. Because the microphone always has to be used for its meaning to be conveyed. It always has to be used by a human being in some kind of, aimed at some end, we should say. So continuing, he says, equipment has a peculiar position intermediate between thing and work, assuming that such a calculated ordering of them is permissible. So if we speak of the mere thingness of the equipment thing, this is to speak of the equipment being denuded of its equipmental being, thus assaulting the thing. That when we talk about the way in which a microphone is a mere thing in relation to a piece of art because of the signification that's involved in a work of art, we look at the microphone and we end up degrading it to being a mere thing in comparison to a piece of art. Yet, the microphone is clearly formed matter. It is clearly something that is more than just matter, right? It has a form in the same way that a sculpture has a form. So if we want to apply this formed matter distinction as a way to make sense of the essence of beings, it fails to make sense of beings in every case. It can only make sense of some beings. And the question then would be, well, why, right? What are the presuppositions involved in that? And if we're still dealing with presuppositions in determining the essence of things, right, those things that are taken for granted or assumed as given, then we're still dealing with the natural attitude, and we have yet to engage in a phenomenological reduction of that being at hand. As Heidegger says, thing being, according to the form-matter distinction, consists in what is then left over. But this remnant is not actually defined in its ontological character. It remains doubtful whether the thingly character ever comes to view at all in the process of stripping off everything equipmental. What it does is it then denies the matter aspect of the painting, and it focuses instead merely on the form. So to think about the thingness of paintings using the form-matter distinction is to actually suppress the material aspect of the painting. And if we're going to suppress the material aspect of the painting, then we can never get at the thingness of the painting. I want to look here from pages 156 to 157. So Heidegger says, thus it comes about that prevailing thing concepts obstruct the way toward the thingly character of the thing, as well as toward the equipmental character of equipment, and all the more toward the workly character of the work. That when we use certain concepts like unifold, the unity of a manifold of sensations, or the form-matter concept, what these are kind of like glasses, that we put these on, and they disclose certain things and yet cover up other things as well. So we're only actually looking at that being at hand from a certain perspective, and we're denying other perspectives that are just as essential to constituting its being. So he says, that is why it is necessary to know about these thing concepts in order to thereby take heed of their provenance and their boundless presumption, but also of their semblance of self-evidence, right? The seeming self-evidence of this idea of formed matter. This knowledge becomes all the more necessary when we risk the attempt to bring to view and express in words the thingly character of the thing, the equipmental character of equipment, and the workly character of the work. To this end, however, only one element is needful: to keep at a distance all the preconceptions and assaults of the above modes of thought, to leave the thing to rest in its own self, for instance, in its thing being. What seems easier than to let a thing be just the being that it is? Or does this turn out to be the most difficult of tasks, particularly if such an intention, to let a being be as it is, represents the opposite of the indifference that simply turns its back upon the being itself in favor of an unexamined concept of being? We ought to turn toward the being, think about it in regard to its being, but by means of this thinking, at the same time, let it rest upon itself in its very own essence. So we should not force beings into concepts, right? Like forcing them into a certain mold that we think makes sense. We should approach a being when we are questioning it like a piece of artwork. We should approach it within its own world. We should approach it within the relations that constitute that artwork itself, thus, in a sense, doing justice to the thing itself. Because we're not approaching it with prejudice, I think is the right way to think about it. So what might this look like? So what Heidegger does is actually engage in this phenomenological reduction here of a piece of art. And he focuses on Van Gogh's shoes. It's in the process of the use of equipment, like a pair of shoes, in the ready-to-hand of the equipment, that we encounter the character of equipment. This is a long passage, but this is Heidegger trying to bring out this painting of Van Gogh, as you can see here on the screen, as it rests as itself within its own world that Van Gogh has tried to disclose. So, Heidegger says here, from the dark opening of the worn insides of the shoes, the toilsome tread of the worker stares forth. In the stiffly rugged heaviness of the shoes, there is the accumulated tenacity of her slow trudge through the far-spreading and ever-uniform furrows of the field swept by a raw wind. On the leather lie the dampness and richness of the soil. Under the soles stretches the loneliness of the field path as evening falls. In the shoes vibrates the silent call of the earth, its quiet gift of the ripening grain and its unexplained self-refusal in the fallow desolation of the wintry field. This equipment is pervaded by uncomplaining worry as to the certainty of bread, the wordless joy of having once more withstood want, the trembling before the impending childbed and shivering at the surrounding menace of death. This equipment belongs to the earth, and it is protected in the world of the peasant woman. From out of this protected belonging, the equipment itself rises to its resting within itself. So we can see how Heidegger is approaching this painting by not examining the way in which the painting has been a matter that has been formed into a certain way, but asking what this painting represents insofar as this is a painting of shoes. What kind of world these shoes would have lived in? What would have been their role in this world? So continuing, he says, but perhaps it is only in the picture that we notice all this about the shoes. The peasant woman, on the other hand, simply wears them. Right? So now we're getting into perhaps the natural attitude or the ready to hand within the painting itself, and not merely of the observer of the painting. If only this simple wearing were so simple. When she takes off her shoes late in the evening in deep but healthy fatigue, and reaches out for them again in the still dim dawn, or passes them by on the day of rest, she knows all this without noticing or reflecting. The equipmental being of the equipment consists indeed in its usefulness. But this usefulness itself rests in the abundance of an essential being of the equipment. We call it reliability. By virtue of this reliability, the peasant woman is made privy to the silent call of the earth. By virtue of the reliability of the equipment, she is sure of her world. World and earth exist for her, and for those who are with her in her mode of being, only thus in the equipment. We say only, and therewith fall into error, for the reliability of the equipment first gives to the simple world its security and assures to the earth the freedom of its steady thrust. The equipmental being of equipment, reliability, keeps gathered within itself all things according to their manner and extent. The usefulness of equipment is nevertheless only the essential consequence of reliability. Right, so here we're looking at this pair of shoes that clearly looks to be worn out, that played a certain role in a certain world, a world inhabited by someone, where the shoes were used for certain ends, taken for granted by that individual. So in a way, this is very similar to a Wittgensteinian approach, but it's different. Right? Because Heidegger is not saying, well, the painting is, the meaning of a painting, right, or the origin of artwork is the use that such a term would play in a language. What Heidegger is doing here is he's looking at the artwork as it is constituted by the artist, with these shoes, where these shoes are meant to signify something. And he's investigating the signification of the shoes by inquiring into the role, the use shoes played. And not merely just anywhere the shoes played, right? But the relations these shoes had to other beings, right? So you can imagine a kind of a whole web that is constructed where it's the relations between things that constitutes the significance of the shoes, that constitutes the significance of the painting, and not merely the painting in itself. So here we're starting to erode the kind of essentialism that says, well, what makes a painting is something that's contained within it, irrelevant of all other relations around it, right? Here, these shoes have a certain context, and they're used in a certain way, right? They have a certain end. So continuing, he says, the worn-out usualness of the equipment then obtrudes itself as the sole mode of being, apparently peculiar to it exclusively. Only blank usefulness now remains visible. It awakens the impression that the origin of equipment lies in a mere fabricating that impresses a form upon some matter. Nevertheless, in its genuinely equipmental being, equipment stems from a more distant source. Matter and form and their distinction have a deeper origin. The repose of equipment resting within itself consists in its reliability. Only in this reliability do we discern what equipment in truth is. But we still know nothing of what we first sought, the thing's thingly character. And we know nothing at all of what we really and solely seek, the workly character of the work in the sense of the work of art. And yet, we have learned that when we approach what is signified in the work of art in terms of its use, and not as a mere thing like a piece of equipment like a pen in writing, but a thing that constitutes meaning within a world, that constitutes actually a world, then we begin to uncover something that is more than just a mere piece of formed matter. So what is at work in a piece of artwork? It is unconcealment, or in other words, it is truth. That the way these shoes represent a certain use for perhaps a peasant, this is a means of unconcealing a way of life, saying something about a time and a place, a people. It is disclosing, it is presenting a certain kind of truth. So Heidegger says Van Gogh's painting is the disclosure of what the equipment, the pair of peasant shoes, is in truth. This being emerges into the unconcealment of its being. The Greeks called the unconcealment of being aletheia. We say truth and think little enough in using this word. If there occurs in the work a disclosure of a particular being, disclosing what and how it is, then there is here an occurring, a happening of truth at work. Because what is at work in this painting is a certain disclosing of a way of life. Now one might ask, well, hold on, isn't it the case that truth is reserved for logic? That truth is that which is only demonstrated through necessary conditions, for example? That we have to look at premises that work to justify a conclusion. And as such, beauty, artwork, aesthetics, right, that does not constitute truth. Merely the painting or aesthetics, it just represents beauty, represents something that pleases us, that we admire in a certain way that is different from truth. This is exactly what Heidegger wants to overturn. He wants to move beyond thinking about artwork as a mere aspect of something beautiful, something pleasant, but return, in a way, to seeing the beauty as a kind of truth. So I want to recap the arguments made thus far in Heidegger's The Origin of the Work of Art. First, the thingly substructure of work is the most immediate actuality of the work. It's the thing perhaps we take for granted the most because it's the thing we encounter most immediately, which is the thingliness of it in terms of being able to touch it, the way in which it interacts with our senses, and the way in which it can be associated with other objects that can be moved around, stored, put on a wall, and so on. Secondly, the thingly substructure of artwork does not belong immediately in the work. As Heidegger says, as soon as we look for such a thingly substructure in the work, we have unwittingly taken the work as equipment, to which we then also ascribe a superstructure supposed to contain its artistic quality. Thirdly, the dominant thing concepts, the bearer of traits, unity of manifold sensations, and formed matter, are inadequate as means of grasping the thingly aspect of the work. Because every time we try to force the thingly aspect of artwork into a kind of mold that already prejudges then what that thing is. And in that way, we do violence, we assault the thing itself by covering up part of the true essence of itself. Heidegger says, we force the work into a preconceived framework by which we obstruct our own access to the work being of the work. So we cannot approach the question of the origin of the work of art from that perspective. Finally, artwork is not the reproduction of some particular entity on hand at any given time, but it is a reproduction of things' general essence. He says, the artwork opens up in its own way the being of beings, because what artwork does is unconceal truth that perhaps is taken for granted, and it reformats it in a different way that makes us take it into account. It is not a mere reproduction or a representation. It is an unconcealing, a disclosing. It is a case of truth. In the second lecture video, I'll look exactly what it means and in what way artwork is a manifestation of truth.